She came west with the contract in her hand and a city address in her past, and every man in Sweetwater Valley said she'd be gone before the first hard frost. The fire proved them wrong. 11:15 on a December night, the barn wall already burning, 14 head of cattle still inside. And the rancher she'd married 3 weeks ago, 18 miles away in the dark, riding hard, not going to make it in time. She didn't wait. She went in. When Wade Calloway came through the gate, the fire was out. The cattle were in the yard. And his wife was standing in the smoke with a bandaged hand and the specific expression of a woman who had already decided long before tonight exactly what kind of person she was going to be out here. He just hadn't known it yet. Neither had she. The Union Pacific didn't slow down for Wyoming. It burned west through October grass the color of old bone. And Clara Reed sat in the third-class car with a contract on her lap and $4.70 in her coin purse, and the stillness of a woman who has already made the decision and is simply waiting for the consequences to begin. The contract was 2 pages. She had read it 11 times between St. Louis and the Colorado border. Not because she didn't understand it, because she did, and understanding it required repeated exposure before it stopped feeling like something that had happened to someone else. Mr. Wade Calloway, age 41, proprietor of Iron Bell Ranch, Sweetwater County, Wyoming Territory, seeks a wife of sound constitution and practical capability to assist in the management of a working cattle operation. Applicant should be in good health, free of dependence, and prepared for the rigors of frontier life. Terms of arrangement to be formalized upon arrival. Sound constitution. That was the phrase. Not beautiful, not accomplished, not charming. Sound, like a fence post, like a water barrel, like a thing you needed to hold weight. Clara folded the contract along its existing crease. Her hands were steady. She was 33 years old, and they had been steady since the week after the funeral, when she'd sat across from the bank officer and understood for the first time that the house she had lived in for 2 years was no longer hers, and that the money Thomas had assured her did not, in any practical sense, exist. The world she had carefully arranged around herself had been built on a foundation she had never been permitted to inspect at. Outside, Wyoming was happening whether she was ready or not. There was so much of it, the sheer, unasked-for scale of the placeland rolling in every direction without asking permission, amber and rust and the yellow of grass that had given up on green but hadn't committed to dying. No buildings, no smoke, no ridgeline to interrupt the sky, which was not the polite blue of Missouri October but something older and more serious, a color that didn't negotiate. She pressed her palm flat against the window glass. Cold already, she had been in cities her entire life. Born in Cincinnati, moved to St. Louis at 20 for work, stayed because Thomas was there, stayed after Thomas wasn't because leaving required capital she didn't have. Cities had rules she understood. Sidewalks went somewhere, buildings had addresses. People had roles and the roles had names, and you knew where you stood by reading the available signage. Wyoming had no signage. She looked at the $4.70. Looked at it the way you looked at something when deciding if it was a fact or a problem. It was a fact. The problem was everything arranged around it: the closed bank account, the sold furniture, the polite farewell from Mr. Devers at the architectural firm, where she had spent 4 years as a drafting assistant, learning to read structural drawings and converting other people's ideas into lines that could bear weight. "You have a real eye for this work, Clara," Mr. Devers had said on her last day. "It's a shame there's no future in for you here." He hadn't meant it as cruelty. That was the thing about cruelty that arrived wrapped in regret. It still landed the same way. Ruth McAllister had found her 3 weeks after she left the firm. Ruth, who ran a boarding house on Locust Street and had arrangements with ranchers in Wyoming and Montana who needed wives and were willing to pay the travel costs to get them. Ruth, who had sat across from Clara at her own kitchen table and said without preamble, "You're 33, practical, and not expecting romance. That makes you valuable to a specific kind of man." Clara had said, "I'm not sure I want to be valuable to a specific kind of man." And Ruth had said, "You've got $4 left after rent. Your landlord is raising rates in November, and you have skills that don't pay a woman what they pay a man. You can be offended by the arrangement, or you can be on the next train west. Both are your right." She was on the train west, which was not the same as not being offended. Both things were true at once. She had learned to manage that kind of double occupancy, The place where the practical fact and the feeling about the practical fact lived in the same small space without resolution. The train lurched around a long curve, and through the westward windows there were mountains. Not the Appalachians she'd seen once as a girl, soft and green and reasonable. These were something else entirely. White to the tops where the snow had already come and not apologized for it. Dark rock faces below. The whole arrangement sitting against the sky like a wall someone had built to tell you that everything you'd known before was behind you now. Clara looked at the mountains for a long time. Then she put the contract back in her traveling bag and watched Wyoming happen to her in silence. The station at Caldwell was a single wooden platform and a ticket office the size of a generous closet. 3 men stood at the far end loading freight onto a flatbed wagon. A woman in a calico apron swept the platform steps without urgency. A dog of indeterminate breed lay in a patch of afternoon sun and declined to acknowledge the train's arrival. Clara stepped down with her 2 traveling cases and stood on the platform in her navy wool travel dress with the two-button jacket and the hat with the ivory ribbon, and felt the full weight of being the most incorrectly dressed person in any direction she cared to look. The woman with the broom wore canvas. The men loading freight wore canvas. The wind off the mountains hit the brim of her hat immediately. She caught it with one hand. She looked down the platform. She did not know what Wade Calloway looked like. The arrangement had not included photographs. Ruth had described him as capable and solvent, which were not physical descriptors, and the contract had supplied his age and occupation, and nothing else. Clara had spent the 2 days since Denver constructing a mental image that was probably wrong, and she was running rapid calculations against the variables she had. 41, rancher, Wyoming. 12 years on the same land, she felt him before she saw him. Not mystical, the sensation of being assessed from behind, efficiently, without theater. He was standing near the water trough at the platform's end, not waiting so much as occupying space in a way that made clear the space had been chosen for sightlines. 6'2", maybe more. Canvas coat, brown flannel beneath, denim worn pale at the knees, a hat that had been somewhere and come back changed by it, tanned to a color that took years of outdoor light to achieve. He looked at her with the practical attention of someone doing an inventory, and when their eyes met he didn't look away. He walked over, no rush. The walk of a man whose internal clock ran on seasons, not minutes, Miss Reed. Not a question. Mr. Calloway. He picked up a larger case without asking, turned toward a wagon tied to the post at the platform's end. She followed because the only alternative was standing in Caldwell, Wyoming, with $4.70, which was not an alternative. The wagon was practical. The horses were practical. Everything about Calloway was practical in a way that made the ivory ribbon on her hat feel like a declaration of principles she was no longer certain she held. He put her case in the wagon bed and climbed to the seat. She climbed up after him, settled her skirt, and he released the brake and they were moving. 14 seconds since he'd spoken, and she was already beginning to understand the shape of this arrangement. They turned off the main street of Caldwell 2 blocks of commerce, a hotel, a general store, a building with a painted sign reading First Sweetwater Bank and Burton Hale Prop, and headed north onto a road that was more of a considered suggestion in the direction of somewhere. The road ran through sagebrush and wire grass, and the mountains moved with them off to the west, and the sky got bigger the further from town they went, which didn't seem geometrically possible, but was nonetheless the case. Wade Calloway did not speak, not aggressively silent. The silence of a man for whom words were a tool kept in the box and reached for when the job required them. Clara lasted 11 minutes. She knew because she counted, a habit from childhood of giving shape to situations that were otherwise too large to manage. How far to the ranch? 18 miles, right. So, 18 miles of this. She stopped waiting for conversation and started looking instead. 4 years of drafting work had trained her to see space as information, the angle of a load-bearing wall, the relationship between a foundation and the ground beneath it, the ways a structure either worked with its terrain or fought it. She turned that same attention on Wade Calloway in profile. He held the reins loose, not careless but deliberate. The horses knew their job and he knew they knew it. His jaw carried the permanent set of a man who had spent years making decisions in wind. There was a quality to his stillness she couldn't classify yet. Not closed exactly. more like latent. The way a structure looked stable at rest, and you only understood what it was built for when you saw it under load. She looked at his hands. Rancher's hands, the kind that had repaired 1,000 things. Then she looked at the road ahead and thought, there is a person inside all that quiet, and I have no idea what he needs or what he has lost. That last word arrived without invitation. Lost. She set it aside, 2 hours to the gate. By the time the iron letters spelling Iron Bell arched over the entrance in the low gold of late afternoon, Clatha's back ached from the wagon bench, and her hat had surrendered any pretense of sitting correctly. She was holding it in her lap because it was that, or lose it to the wind. The ranch was bigger than she'd allowed herself to expect. The part of her that had been managing expectations since St. Louis had imagined something modest. What she saw instead was a compound, a 2-story main house of pine timber, gone silver-gray with years, a barn that was serious about its work, 3 outbuildings in various stages of upkeep, a corral where horses stood with the patience of animals that had somewhere to be. Fencing ran in all directions further than she could easily track, and then the windows. The downstairs windows were open, catching the last of the afternoon light. The upstairs windows were all shut, curtains drawn heavy cotton, faded blue closed against the afternoon, as if whoever had drawn them had decided that particular light wasn't welcome on that floor. Not boarded up, not neglected, deliberately closed. She filed that away and went to find where she lived now. The kitchen told the truth about a house. Clara had learned this working with Miss Edivas, who believed a building's character revealed itself in the spaces between the grand gestures, not the parlor but the kitchen, the mudroom, the back stair. The places where daily life accumulated without anyone meaning it to. Iron Bell's kitchen was large and south-facing, which was the right decision. Winter sun through the south window from November to March. The stove was a home comfort with 6 burners and a warming shelf, showing regular use in the grease-darkened cast iron and the residue around the firebox. The work table had knife marks going back years. The coffee pot on the back burner was the size of a serious commitment. And then she looked at the chimney. She walked to the stove and looked up the line of the stovepipe to where it connected to the chimney flue, and she tipped her head the 3 degrees necessary to confirm what she'd already suspected from the outside. The chimney ran too close to the north wall, and the angle of the junction was wrong, off by maybe 4 degrees from where it should be relative to the prevailing wind direction out of the northwest. In summer, irrelevant. In winter, when the northwest wind came down off the Sweetwater Range and the pressure differential changed the chimney's draw, it would pull backward. Smoke into the kitchen instead of up and out. She was still examining the junction angle when Wade came in from the barn, hung his coat, washed his hands, and began opening cupboard doors with the focused manner of a man assembling dinner from memory. Same meal every night, she could tell from the absence of deliberation. Beans from the pot that had been soaking, salt pork from the ice box, cornbread from a pan he pulled from the oven shelf without checking, because he already knew what was in it. The chimney flue, Clara said. He looked up from the beans. The junction where the stovepipe meets the flue, it's angled wrong for your northwest wind pattern. When pressure drops in winter storms, you get backdraw. Smoke comes in instead of going out. He looked at the chimney, the look of a man who had looked at something many times and never quite looked at it. Then at her, you know about chimney flues. I worked for an architectural firm in St. Louis. 4 years. I drafted structural drawings and learned to read the ones I didn't draft. A misdirected combustion gas is a structural problem. The principle applies whether it's a commercial building or a ranch kitchen. He stood with the beans and considered that, not dismissively placing the information alongside other information, finding where it fit. It's been working fine, in years without bad northwest wind events during draw season. Or you've been leaving a window cracked and attributing the stuffiness to other causes. She paused. I'm not criticizing the construction. I'm describing what I see. He put the beans on the stove and said nothing more, which she was beginning to understand was not the same as disagreeing. Supper in 20 minutes, he said. Your room is the corner room on the first floor. Right side of the hall. He went back to the beans. Clara picked up her case and walked to her room, past the narrow staircase leading up. At the landing, the door at the top had the quality of a door that had been closed a long time, different from a door recently shut. Something about how the wood settled in the frame, how a house shifted around an absence, Her room was simple and recently cleaned. Floorboards swept, quilt clean, small dresser with a pitcher and basin. Someone had prepared it. Wade Calloway had swept the floor and found a clean quilt and made the bed, even if he hadn't thought of a single word of welcome at the station. She stood in the middle of the room and took stock of what she had and what she had arrived in. The traveling dress, adequate for a train and wagon but already stiff from 2 days. Her everyday dress in brown cotton, 2 shirtwaists, skirt that was practical. The work clothes from St. Louis, the apron, the blouse she'd worn for drafting when she expected ink on herself, her winter coat, her city boots with the low heel, a sturdier pair she'd bought second-hand before leaving. None of it was right for this place. The city boots were wrong. The cotton dress was wrong for October cold. She would need to remedy this before serious weather came. She changed out of the travel dress and went back to the kitchen. They ate. The beans were adequate. The cornbread was good, not too dense. Enough lard to have actual texture. She ate all of it because she'd been on the train for 2 days, and her body made its own decisions about gratitude independently of her opinions about the situation. Midway through the meal, she looked up and found Wade watching her. The careful watching of a man taking inventory and not wanting to be caught at it. When their eyes met, he looked back at his beans. She looked around the kitchen. On the shelf near the window, a tin of tobacco pushed to the back, unused, a Bible with the spine broken in 3 places, a calendar from 1881 that hadn't been replaced, and above the cook stove, the only decorative item in the room, a framed photograph, palm-sized, of a woman, fair hair. A composed expression, the kind you held for the length of time a photograph required. She was looking slightly to the left of center, which meant the photographer had asked her to look at something she couldn't see. Clara looked at the photograph for exactly long enough to register it, and then looked away. "The stovepipe," Wade said without transition. She looked at him. "After supper, I looked at the angle." He addressed his cornbread. "You're right about the draft issue. It's a manageable fix. The junction bracket can be repositioned without opening the wall. You'd need to resecure the flue collar. I know how to do it. I know you do." Another silence. This one had a different weight, less purely empty. "I'll fix it before the first hard weather," he said. "I can hold the bracket if you want an extra pair of us." He looked at her again with that measuring quality. She looked back and let him measure. She had been measured by men for competence and usefulness her whole working life. She knew how to stand in that kind of attention without flinching. "All right," he said. "Not warm, not unwelcoming." "Factual." She nodded. They finished the meal. She washed the dishes without being asked because it was the logical next step, and he went out for the evening barn check. She stood at the kitchen window and watched him walk across the yard in the last light with the ease of a man who knew this ground well enough to walk it blind. The mountains had gone purple and the sky above them shifted from orange to that particular Wyoming dark that had no real transition, just a line where warm color became cold and clear and full of stars that city light had been hiding from her entire life. She looked at those stars until the cold came through the glass, then dried the last dish and went to bed and did not sleep easily because every new place sounds different at night. An iron bell at night sounded like nothing she had ever heard. Wind, cattle, silence, and something far off that might have been an owl, or might have been the land itself, making a sound she didn't have a name for yet. The morning gave her back her steadiness. She was dressed and in the kitchen before 5. The coffee pot was on the stove before she understood the kitchen well enough to know where everything was kept, which meant she spent 10 minutes learning its logic before the coffee started, finding the coffee in the second tin she tried, the good pot hook in the 3rd drawer. This was how you learned a place, not by being told, by needing the thing and going to find it. Wade was already in the barn. She'd heard him at 4:30 boots on the stairs, back door, then nothing. She poured the first coffee into a cup she found in the second cupboard, took it to the back door, and looked at Iron Bell Ranch in the early light. The barn sat immediately south of the house, set for efficient winter access, good decision. Whoever built this knew which way the snow came. The smaller outbuildings arranged in a functional arc that maximized access from the barn without wasting steps. The corral clean, rails in good repair, and pinned to the barn's east-facing wall, large enough to see from here plans of some kind. She walked over. Plans for extending the barn, drawn in pencil on good drafting paper. Clean lines, reasonable proportions. The main structure was sound and the addition was correctly proportioned to the existing walls, except the load-bearing post on the east side of the addition. She walked the length of the proposed extension, counting the distance from the existing wall. The post was marked at 12 feet. For a structure this width, 12 feet meant the snow load on a Wyoming winter roof, 2 feet of heavy wet snow, 3 feet in a bad year, would put asymmetric force on the ridge beam. Not this winter, necessarily. Maybe not next winter. Third winter, in a storm with real weight, the east wall of the new addition would announce the problem. She found a pencil in her jacket pocket. She always had a pencil. She circled the post position and drew a bracket with an arrow 8 feet, not 12, and the line of force she was accounting for. Clean and minimal, the kind of annotation she had made 1,000 times on other people's drawings. She heard him before she saw him. The barn door, footsteps that knew the ground. Wade stopped when he saw her at the plans. He looked at the drawing, at the circle she'd made. Then at her. The east post is 2 feet too far out. She kept her voice even, the tone she used for structural problems with contractors who hadn't noticed them first. Not apologetic, not aggressive, just the information plainly delivered. At 12 feet from the existing wall, your ridge beam takes asymmetric load in deep snow. The deflection is gradual. You won't see it in the first season. By the third or fourth winter with real accumulation, the east wall leans. He looked at the drawing for a long time. The early light came over the mountains and hit the drafting paper and made the pencil lines sharp and clear. He was not a man who rushed through looking at something that deserved time. I've been building to this plan for 3 weeks, he said. The structural concept is right. The proportions are right. Just the post position. He stood quiet, working it through from the inside. Show me, he said. She marked the corrected position and walked the distance on the ground so he could see it with his feet and not only his eyes. He walked it behind her, measuring the way ranchers measured feel and experience and years of knowing what this ground had done before. He stood at the new mark and looked back at the existing wall and looked at the proposed roof line, and she stopped trying to read his face and simply waited. We'll move the post, he said. After breakfast, she noticed the word we, not warm, not deliberate, not even conscious, just the natural singular they had apparently arrived at on the second morning. I'll put the coffee on, she said. They ate breakfast with a quality of shared silence that was no longer actively uncomfortable, just unfamiliar the way a new coat was unfamiliar before the wool softened. She made biscuits from the flour in the pantry because there was flour and lard and buttermilk, and she knew how to make biscuits without thinking. Wade ate 3 without comment, which she chose to interpret charitably. They moved the post before noon. He did the physical work. She held the line and checked the plumb with the level she found hanging in the barn. Twice she said 1/2 inch left, and he moved it 1/2 inch left without discussion. By the time the bracket was set and the post braced, the correction was clean and the extension would bear its load correctly. He looked at it from 10 feet back when they were done. She stood beside him and looked at it too. Good, he said. Not to her exactly, to the work. But she was the only other person there. Then he pulled his hat down and went back to the morning's remaining tasks. And she went to the lean-to to start learning where the tools were kept. And the day continued in the way days on a working ranch continued, without pause, without ceremony, without waiting for anyone to decide they were ready. Burton Hale arrived at 2:30 on a horse, too well-groomed for Wyoming dust. Clara was at the side of the house working on the kitchen garden bed, not planting, not yet, just turning the dead stalks under and checking the drainage. The drainage ran toward the foundation instead of away from it, and in a wet spring that was going to matter. She'd found a spade in the lean-to and was using it. Her good skirt had dirt on the hem. She didn't care. She heard the horse before she saw the rider and looked up to watch a man in a black vest and clean hat pick his way up the ranch road with the deliberateness of someone staging an entrance. He pulled up at the gate, looked around the yard, then at her, and tipped his hat with the courtesy of a man who had practiced courtesy until it was indistinguishable from warmth. Mrs. Calloway, I'd presume. His voice carried the comfortable resonance of a man who had learned that resonance communicated authority before words arrived. Burton Hale. I run the first Sweetwater bank in town. To offer my personal congratulations on the marriage. She straightened up from the garden with the spade in her hand and looked at him. The name she'd seen on the building 2 blocks into Caldwell on the way through yesterday. The name Coleswade's jaw had hardened at when she mentioned it over supper. Not Mrs. Calloway yet. The name hadn't settled, she was still trying it on. "Thank you," she said. He smiled. The smile arrived and departed quickly, and what was underneath it was harder to read than the smile itself. "It's a fine operation Wade runs here. His father built something worth protecting." A pause that was not quite casual. "I'm sure Wade's mentioned the note his father took out with us back in '75. Just a small remaining balance comes due in March. Not something to worry about just now, I mention it, so you're oriented to the full picture of the rancher's situation." Another pause. It would be a shame for such a fine piece of land to encounter complications. Clara looked at him with the same attention she gave structural drawings, looking for the load path, finding where the stress concentrated. He was looking back at her with the expression of a man delivering information he had been carrying and had decided this was the correct moment to set down. "Wade and I will want to look over all the ranch's business records together," she said. "When there's time. We're just getting settled, of course. Hale tipped his hat again, the warmth in the gesture so polished she could see herself in it and know it for a mirror rather than a window. "I look forward to meeting you properly in town. Welcome to Sweetwater Valley." He turned his horse and rode back down the road at the same measured pace he'd arrived. Clara stood in the kitchen garden with dirt on her hem and the spade in her hand, and she did not move for a long moment. Then she went back to the drainage problem. Wade came out of the barn 20 minutes later, saw her still in the garden, saw Hale's dust settling on the road south. "Hale came by," she said. His face changed. Not surprise, the opposite of surprise. The look of a man who had been waiting for something to arrive and recognized it when it did. "I saw him on the road. He mentioned a note, his father's, due in March." Wade picked up a fence rail leaning against the barn wall and carried it toward the corral without answering. She watched him walk away from it the way he'd walked away from the chimney question the evening before, not rudely, not deliberately, but with his shoulders set in the way of a man who knew a thing was present and was not ready to face the center of it. She did not follow. Not yet. She stood in the garden dirt and watched him go and felt the first edge of something she couldn't name easily, not alarm, more like the sensation of standing on a beam that was correctly sized but hadn't been connected to the rest of the structure yet. Load was coming. The question was whether the connections would hold when it arrived. On the 5th day, Agnes Polk came without announcement in a small wagon with a speckled horse and the demeanor of someone who had been arriving without announcement at Iron Bell for years and saw no reason to change the practice. She tied the horse, came around to the kitchen door, and knocked twice with the authority of a woman who was going to come in regardless of the answer. Clara answered. Agnes was somewhere between 52 and 58, built for endurance rather than delicacy. Hair pinned up in the manner of a woman who had decided what she thought about hair in her early 30s and hadn't revisited the question since. She looked at Clara the way you looked at an unfamiliar piece of machinery, not unkindly, but comprehensively. Agnes Polk. General Store and Post Office, Caldwell. She looked past Clara into the kitchen. "You've rearranged the pots. They were stored in the wrong order for the way the stove works." Agnes Polk's eyebrows made a small, considered movement. She came in and sat at the kitchen table with the ease of a woman who had sat there before, and she accepted the coffee Clara poured without ceremony. "You make your coffee with the creek water," she said. "Not a question. The well water has a mineral taste before 9 in the morning. It's a hardness issue with the aquifer. It clears by midday. The creek runs off mountain snowmelt at this temperature and doesn't have that problem." Agnes held the cup and looked at Clara over the rim with the practiced neutrality of a woman who had learned that showing your hand too early cost you information. "Wade's not here," she said. "He's on the east pasture. One of the fence sections had post-heave from the full freeze. He mentioned you're a drafting woman." "From St. Louis, I was." For 4 years, Agnes set her cup down with the careful precision of a piece in a game. "Burton Hale come by yet?" The directness of it arriving without setup, as if she'd been waiting for the right moment, made Clara recalibrate the visit entirely. "Day before yesterday," she said. Agnes made a sound that was not quite a word. "He always comes by when something changes at Iron Bell." She turned her cup on the table, a slow thinking gesture. "The Calloway family has been in Sweetwater since before the territory was a territory. Wade's father Amos built this place with his own hands. He was a good man and not a suspicious one, which made certain situations more costly than they needed to be. Clara listened. She did not ask what situations. She had found in 4 years at the firm that when someone was choosing whether to give you information, the thing that stopped them was often the impression that you wanted it too much. Agnes stood and pulled on her coat with the efficiency of a woman for whom putting on a coat had stopped being a ceremony decades ago. I'll bring the dry goods order out on Saturday. Wade usually takes it at the gate. I'll be here. Agnes was at the door when she stopped and looked back over her shoulder. You moved the pots correctly, she said. The way they were before made extra steps. She left. Clara sat with her coffee and understood that she had just been told something, though not the full shape of it yet. Agnes Polk had not come out here because of the dry goods. She went back to the kitchen garden drainage and worked until the light started going gold. And when Wade came in from the east pasture, she had a pot of stew on the stove and said only, Agnes Polk came by, and he said, Agnes generally does. And they ate the stew, and she thought about Burton Hale and timetables and the silence Wade had used when she'd mentioned the note. She noted the drawer nearest the pantry door, the one with the slightly sticky pull that suggested it wasn't open daily. She was not going to open it uninvited. She was not going to open it at all without his knowing. But she noted it the way she had noted the chimney angle and the post position and the drainage slope, those where you noted a problem in a structure you were responsible for, even when the problem was not yet in your jurisdiction. The calf in the east stall had a loose wrap on its near foreleg. She'd noticed it on her way through the barn at dusk and greeted it without fair. Small things, consequential. The sum of what you could learn about a place in 5 days if you looked at it correctly. She went to bed that night with the feeling she had sometimes at the start of a complex drafting job, the sense of a structure's full dimensions beginning to reveal themselves, more load-bearing than the surface suggested, more worth understanding than she had initially allowed herself to expect. The fire started on the 12th night at 11:15. She smelled it before she heard it. Not the stove smell, which contained iron and wood and the residue of the salt pork fat that never entirely left the burner surface. This smell was open and sharp and carried the particular urgency that smoke had when it came from somewhere it wasn't supposed to be. She was out of bed in the time it took to identify the smell. Feet into her work boots, she'd started leaving them by the bed after the first week when she understood that this kind of terrain required being ready. Coat over her nightdress. She grabbed the coat from the peg and was moving the back door, the yard. The cold hit her like a deliberate thing, 30 degrees and windy, and in the wind she could hear it now, not crackling, not roaring, just the first sound of something catching and considering its options. The barn, east side the corner where the lanterns hung. She could see the glow from 20 yards. Wade was on the far north pasture, riding the fence line he'd been checking since afternoon. 20 minutes minimum to get back. 30 in the dark over unfamiliar ground. And in 30 minutes, a fire in a barn with 14 head of cattle and dry straw and October wind had 30 minutes to become something that could not be undone. The water trough between house and barn held 60 gallons at last check. Not enough to fight a serious fire. Which meant the fire was not the first problem. The cattle were the first problem she ran. The barn's east door opened in one motion. She'd learned which direction the latch stuck on the second day. Smoke hit her, low and rolling, not thick yet but moving with purpose along the floor. The source was the corner where the lanterns hung, a coal oil lantern that had come off its hook. Oil pooled on the floor, fire spreading from it in a slow, deliberate circle. Eating hay that was bone dry after weeks without rain. The cattle knew before she got to them. They were already pressing toward the far doors, making the sound lower and more purposeful than their ordinary noise. She counted fast 3 head near the east door at the limit of their tie ropes. 4 in the center stalls, 3 further back, 4 more in the south addition. She started with the ropes nearest the fire. Quick release knots, Wade used them on every tie, which she'd noted on the second morning as a habit worth understanding. She got the 3 east animals loose in 40 seconds and drove them out the east door with her body and her voice, and they went because the fire behind them was more insistent than the person in front of them. Kentra stalls next. 4 animals, rope, drive, door. The smoke had thickened. She crouched. It was worst at standing height, and she could breathe better at 4 feet. She felt the heat on her left side where the fire had grown into the straw pile, the back stalls. She couldn't see clearly anymore. She knew where they were because she'd walked this barn every morning for 12 days and had looked at the layout the way she looked at everything, like a floor plan. Something she would need to navigate later. Her hands found the ropes in the dark and she got them loose by feel and drove the animals forward by sound and pressure, talking the whole time, low and even. Come on, and they moved, the south addition. She felt along the wall to the connecting door. She pulled her coat sleeve over her hand and opened it. 4 animals in here, less settled in their routines than the others. She had to get her shoulder against one flank and push with everything she had before it shifted and went. 14 animals in the yard. She counted them twice in the dark. Then she went back for the tag. Not the most rational decision she'd ever made. She didn't make it rationally. She made it the way you made decisions when time compressed, by knowing what mattered and going toward it. The good saddles were on the first rack, right inside the door, which was still passable. She got 3 saddles and the good bridles and the medicine box from the supply shelf and dropped them in the yard, went back once more for the tools hung on the near wall, and then the smoke made further decisions for her by becoming something she could not breathe through, and she came out into the yard and stood with her hands on her knees. The fire was in the straw in the east corner and had reached the far wall of the barn. Not the structure itself, the heavy timber hadn't caught, but the east wall was burning and the light of it was visible from the road. The trough. She dragged the burlap feed sacks from the supply pile, soaked them in trough water, and spent the next 20 minutes doing the only thing 20 minutes and 60 gallons could do against a bonfire. Committed to one wall, she kept it from jumping to the house. The house sat 40 feet west and the wind ran northwest and the sparks were arcing toward the roof overhang and the woodpile. She soaked the sacks and beat the sparks off the overhang and the side wall and kept beating until the sound of hooves on the road meant someone was coming. Wade Pot came through the gate at a run and pulled up when he saw the cattle in the yard, the tack, supplies in a pile, the burlap in her hands, the east wall burning, and Clara standing between the house and the barn in her nightdress and coat and work boots. He took it all in about 4 seconds. How many out? His voice was the voice of a man managing himself under pressure. All 14. I counted twice. He looked at the cattle, at the wall, at her hand's house. 2 sparks on the overhang. I got them. She nodded toward the trough. I'm nearly out of water. We need to keep the west wall wet, so it doesn't, I know. He was always a horse in one motion, horse secured to the post, at the trough with the remaining burlap before she finished the sentence. They worked the fire together until it found the limits of what was available to burn, and began the long process of stopping. The east wall was gone. The structure held. The cattle were in the yard and the house was whole. At some point in the last hour, her hat, she had been wearing it, the one with the ivory ribbon, grabbed with her coat without thinking, had come off somewhere in the yard. She noticed this when the immediate crisis ended and she was standing in the cold with singed hair at her temples and smoke in her eyes, and a burning sensation across the back of her right hand where she'd gotten too close to the wall. Wade was looking at her right hand. Come inside, he said. The cattle are contained and the fire's done. Come inside. In the kitchen he filled the basin with cold water and put her hand in it, and she let him, because the hand had begun to make its opinion known, and cold water was the right answer. He found the medicine tin from the cabinet she'd reorganized on day 3, took out the burner salve, and bandaged her right hand at the kitchen table with the careful attention of a man who had dealt with injuries before and took the task seriously. His hands were steady. So were hers, which was different from the steadiness on the train. That had been determined steadiness, willed into place. This was the steadiness that came after, when the body had spent everything it had and arrived somewhere quiet. 14, he said, looking at the bandage. 14, she confirmed. The spotted heifer was the last one out of the south addition. She planted on me. He tied off the bandage and sat back and looked at her, not the inventory look from the station, not the measuring look from the barn plans. Something that didn't have an easy category. She filed it. You went it back in for the tack, he said. The saddles were worth saving. After getting 14 animals out, there was time. He was quiet. She thought he might say something she would have to decide what to do with. Instead, he got up and put the coffee on. because it was 3 in the morning and the fire was out and the cattle were in the yard and there was nothing to be done about any of it until daylight. The corrected chimney drew cleanly as it always did now, pulling the heat straight up and out, the kitchen filling warm and clear. They sat at the kitchen table with the coffee, and neither of them spoke. Not the silence of two people who had nothing to say. The silence of two people sitting in the aftermath of a shared thing that had not yet found the right words to describe itself. That was enough for the night. Both of them seemed to understand that. Outside, Iron Bell Ranch was standing. 14 cattle were in the yard. The house was whole. The fire was out. All of that was true, and it was enough. She finished her coffee and went to bed just before 4 and slept without dreaming, the deep practical sleep of someone who has done the work and earned the rest. When she woke at 5:30, the yard was still dark and she could hear the cattle moving quietly outside, and the sound of Wade already in the barn beginning the morning check, and she got up and put the kettle on and started the day. By noon, Agnes Polk and 3 others had ridden out. They stood in the yard and looked at the ruined east wall, and looked at the tack and supplies still piled near the corral where they had been dropped in the dark, and they looked at Clara. Agnes's face did the thing it did when she was deciding something and had nearly decided it. She looked at the spotted heifer, standing apart from the others with the particular expression of an animal that knows it caused trouble and would do it again. Then she looked at the 3 women with her: Ruth Ingram, May Doer, Josephine Hatch, and said what the valley needed to hear. She knew what she was doing when she came here, not for Clara's benefit specifically. For the record, the one Agnes kept, which was the real record of Sweetwater Valley, the one that outlasted legal documents and bank transfers and the careful architecture of bad faith. Clara was at the corral retying the lead on the spotted heifer when Agnes said it. She didn't turn around. Just kept her hands on the rope and let the words land where they were going to land and kept working. Because the work didn't pause for verdicts, which was one of the things she had begun to appreciate about it. November arrived the way winter arrived in Sweetwater Valley, not with the gradual cooling of a place negotiating the season's terms, but with the finality of a door closing on everything that had come before it. One morning the creek ran clear and the grass held its pale gold. The next morning 2 inches of snow sat on the fence posts, and the mountains to the west had gone entirely white, and the change had happened in the night without asking anyone's opinion about the timing. Clara stood at the barn door in the early dark and looked at it. Her breath made small clouds in the air. The flannel shirt she was wearing had been in the rancher's supply closet, left behind by a seasonal hand 2 years ago. Too large in the shoulders, exactly right everywhere else. She had stopped caring about the shoulders the same week she'd started leaving her work boots by the bed sometime around day 8. When the line between preparing for the place and simply living in it had stopped being visible. The navy travel dress was in the back of the wardrobe. The hat with the ivory ribbon she had found in the barnyard the morning after the fire, slightly singed at the brim, and set on the shelf in her room where she could see it from the bed. Not sentimentality, accuracy. She wanted to remember the distance between who she had been on that platform and who she was becoming, because the distance was already considerable, and it had only been 3 weeks. The spotted heifer had tested the south fence at dawn. Clara had already walked that section in the dark with the lantern and found what she expected: the tension wire on the 3rd span had gone slack overnight. The freeze-thaw cycle in the ground working at the near post's anchor. She had retightened it with the fence stretcher from the lean-to and reinforced the post base with the gravel she'd noted in the supply shed on her 2nd day. By the time Wade came out at 5, she was already back at the barn. He looked at the south fence line from the corral gate and then said nothing, which she had learned to read as confirmation that it had been handled correctly. The bull in the east stall was the more pressing problem. She had been watching him for 2 days, the posture change first. A 2-degree drop in the angle he held his head at the water trough. Then the way he stood apart from the others, with the specific stillness of an animal conserving energy rather than resting. She had the ranching manual she'd ordered from a St. Louis bookseller before leaving, carried in her trunk all the way from Missouri, and she had read the relevant chapter 3 times before dawn. Steam inhalation with salt and eucalyptus oil. She had the eucalyptus from the medicine box, the canvas for the sling she'd need to rig. and the focused attention of someone who understood that catching a respiratory complaint at the first stage rather than the second was the difference between a recoverable problem and an unrecoverable one. Wade looked in on the bull at mid-morning. He looked at what she had set up: the steam pail, the oil, the canvas sling keeping the animal's head in the correct position, and he was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when something had exceeded what he'd been expecting. "Ranching manual," she said, without looking up from adjusting the sling angle. "Which chapter?" 12. Respiratory complaints in confined winter stock. He crouched beside her and checked the gland beneath the jaw with 2 fingers. The practiced assessment of a man who had done this enough times to need no instrument other than his hands. "Caught it before the secondary stage. I noticed the posture change 2 days ago." He was holding his head lower than usual and standing apart from the others. At the trough, he stood and looked at the canvas sling and at her and then at the bull again. Not impressed, in the performed way of a man managing his surprise more, the face of someone recalibrating a calculation that had been running on incomplete data and finding the new numbers more interesting than the original ones. "I'll check him again at 3, he said. "I'll be here," she said. By the following morning, the bull was weight-bearing and eating with the unremarkable appetite of an animal that had forgotten it had recently been unwell, which was the best outcome available. Clara noted it in her record book, the one she'd started the first week, logging every animal by physical characteristic and temperament and the small deviations that indicated something worth watching. Wade found a book on their kitchen table one evening while she was in the barn and read 3 pages of it, standing up before she came back and saw him reading it. He set it down. She sat down. They ate supper and neither of them said anything about the record book. But the next morning he told her, without preamble, that the second bull in the North Corral had been favoring his left rear quarter since September, and she should add it to whatever she was tracking. Agnes Polk came on a Saturday with the dry goods order, and 3 women Clara had not met. They stood in the yard looking at the ruined east wall of the barn, the rebuilt section already framed, Wade having started the repair within 48 hours of the fire, and their faces carried the quality of people confirming what they had already heard and wanted to verify. Agnes introduced them: Ruth Ingram, whose husband ran the spread 6 miles north; May Doerr, whose family had been in Sweetwater longer than anyone currently living there; Josephine Hatch, 28 and recently widowed, running her late husband's claim alone, which the valley had not yet decided how to classify. Clara offered coffee. 4 accepted. They sat at the kitchen table and looked around the kitchen with the frank assessment of women who understood kitchens as a form of intelligence, and Clara handed them cups and sat down herself and let them look without performance. Maidra was 60 or close to it, with the weathered quality of a woman who had not spent much time indoors in the last 30 years. She looked at Clara with the directness of someone who had outlasted enough Wyoming winters to feel she'd earned the right to skip the preamble. "You all got the cattle out before the structure caught 14, Clara said. The east wall was already compromised by the time the fire ran out of fuel, and the house, 2 sparks on the overhang. I had the burlap wet." May looked at her for a moment. At the map pinned to the wall beside the window, the detailed survey drawing Clara had been building since her first week. Buildings and boundary lines and drainage patterns and wind directions and soil notes and the measurements of every fence section she'd walked. May studied it the way someone studied a thing they hadn't expected to find. "You drew this," May said. "Week 1. I needed to understand what I was managing. Amos Calloway never did anything like that. He kept it all in his head." "Memory is useful," Clara said. "But you can't hand a memory to someone else if you need help." May looked at her for another moment, then picked up a coffee. Agnes, from across the table, caught Clara's eye with the brief, direct look of someone confirming a verdict they had already reached privately. Josephine Hatch leaned forward slightly. "The valley's been watching to see what you'd do out here. Since you came, I know they expected you to last until the first hard weather and then find a reason to leave. I don't have anywhere to leave to." She said it without self-pity, purely as arithmetic. "And I have no interest in living somewhere that doesn't need me." Josephine looked at Agnes. Agnes looked at her coffee. May Doerr made a sound in the back of her throat that Clara had already begun to understand as the Sweetwater Valley equivalent of a standing ovation. It was only afterward, helping Agnes carry the dry goods to the kitchen shelf, that Agnes said quietly, "Burton Hale was in the store on Thursday. He was asking who you'd spoken to since you arrived. What you'd been doing with your time." Clara put a flour sack on the shelf and turned around. "I told him you'd been repairing a barn and running a cattle operation," Agnes said. She met Clara's eyes with the level attention of a woman communicating something she'd decided not to say directly. "I told him you seemed like the kind of woman who paid attention." She left 30 minutes later, and Clara stood at the kitchen door, watching the wagon go, and thought about what kind of problem Hale had been expecting her to be, and whether she was in the process of becoming a worse one than he'd anticipated. Wade left for Cheyenne on a Monday in the third week of November. He had told her 4 days before, not asking permission, but the way he told her things that had been decided directly, without preface. He needed to buy breeding stock from a rancher north of Cheyenne. He would be gone 3 days. Here was what she needed to know while he was away. They sat at the kitchen table for an hour, and he went through the operation with the organized thoroughness of a man who had been keeping track of everything alone for 12 years and had a reliable internal filing system for it. Which animals needed watching, where the extra feed was stored. The south fence section near the creek that was borderline on tension and should not be tested by anything heavier than a passing deer until spring. How to operate the pump if it stuck in the cold, which it did when the temperature dropped below a certain point, and what that point was. She wrote it down. He watched her write it down, and something moved across his face briefly that she couldn't categorize, not surprise, but something adjacent to surprise that had been moderated by the time it reached his presence. "The east pasture animals," he said. "The spotted heifer. She'll press at the temporary tension from the fire repair. She's been testing it, I know. I've been reinforcing the tension on that section every other morning." He looked at her. "Since when?" "Since the morning after the fire, when I watched her run her shoulder along it." He was quiet. The small internal adjustment of a person who has received new data and is incorporating it. He left on Monday morning before dawn. She stood at the gate and watched the wagon until it became a dust trail, and then nothing. Then she went back to work, because it was the only reasonable response to being alone on an 1,800-acre cattle operation in November in Sweetwater County, Wyoming Territory. The first day she managed. The second day she managed and also found time in the late afternoon when the livestock were settled and the light was doing its low-angle November thing, to go upstairs for the first time, not the locked room. The hold itself, which needed cleaning. She had been working through the house methodically since arriving, not because Wade's housekeeping was poor, but because cleaning was how she learned a space. The upstairs hall was dusty in the way of a space that had been avoided rather than simply neglected, and she swept it and wiped down the wainscoting and cleared the cobweb from the corner at the top of the stairs. The locked door was at the end of the hall. She swept up to it and back. Was turning to take the dustpan downstairs when she saw that the chipped iron lock had a key in it, still in the lock, as if someone had placed it there and then not returned to either use it or take it back. She stood in the hall with the broom and looked at the key. She had identified this door on the first day as a boundary and decided to respect it. Not because the boundary seemed healthy. She had been in this house long enough to understand that a locked room wasn't healthy, that healthy things didn't have keys left in them and grow dusty in this particular deliberate way, but because it was his boundary and he hadn't given her the right to cross it. She went downstairs. She cooked supper for one, which was different from cooking for two, in ways that were not only arithmetical. She ate at the kitchen table and listened to iron bells settle around her in the dark and did not think about the key. Except that she did. She thought about it, the way you thought about a load-bearing element you couldn't see from the outside, knowing it was there, knowing it was doing something, not knowing yet what it was holding up or what would shift if it were disturbed. On the third day, she went upstairs again. The key was still in the lock. Her hand went to it before the intention was fully formed, and she understood in the space between the intention and the movement that she was going to open the door, and that this was either the worst idea she'd had since stepping onto the Union Pacific, or the only idea that was going to move anything forward. The door opened on a room that had not been entered in a long time. Not a storage room, a bedroom. A woman's bedroom. She understood it immediately and completely, the way you understood a structural drawing when you had the context for it. The iron bed with the blue quilt, the small dresser with the oval mirror, dried lavender on the window ledge, still holding its shape after years without water, and something that might have been yarrow beside it. The wardrobe with the door slightly ajar, showing the edge of a pale dress. Clara stood in the doorway. Did not go in, just stood. On the small shelf beside the bed, a Bible, a tin of hairpins, a book with the spine cracked open to a middle page as if the reader had set it down to do something and intended to come back, and a journal. Dark leather, the cover worn soft at the corners. She was not going to read it. She had decided that before the door opened. She had decided it clearly, and her hands had apparently not been consulted in the decision, because they moved toward the shelf and took the journal and opened it to the middle before she had finished deciding not to, a page near the end. The handwriting was tight and slanting. The pen pressed harder on some words than others in the way of a person writing under a weight that showed in the pressure. February 14, 1879. I am so cold here, not the weather. The other kind. She closed the journal, put it back exactly where it had been, the same orientation, the corner touching the same point on the shelf. She backed out of the room, pulled the door closed, left the key in the lock. She went downstairs and stood in the middle of the kitchen and did not move for a long time, not crying, not panicking, doing something harder than either of those sitting with the full unmanaged weight of what she had just read and what it meant. Ellen Calloway had come from somewhere else, had come to a place that was not her place and tried to make it hers, and had found it cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature, and she had died of it, gradually, by degrees, in the way things died when the system they depended on failed to maintain them. And Clara Reed, from St. Louis, Missouri, was standing in the same kitchen, same house, same man, same October arrival, and same Wyoming winter closing in. She was different, she knew this, not with arrogance, but with the same precision she applied to structural problems. She had come here with skills and intention, and a practical understanding of load-bearing systems that Ellen Calloway may not have had. But the question applied regardless. Was she going to end up cold in the same way? Was the locked room upstairs a preview or a warning, and was there a functional difference between those two things? She sat down at the kitchen table and put her head down on her folded arms and allowed herself 1 full minute of not managing any of it, just setting it on the floor and breathing just that, 1 minute by her internal count. Then she got up and went out to check the south fence section, because the spotted heifer had been quiet since morning, and quiet from that particular animal meant she was conserving energy for something. The heifer was at the fence. Of course she was. Clara tightened the tension wire and looked at the animal and said, "You and me both then." The heifer regarded her with the large, steady gaze of a creature entirely unbothered by existential questions and went back to her fence. Clara went back to work. Wade came back on Thursday afternoon. She heard the wagon and came to the gate. He looked at her with the particular attention of a man who had been checking something in his head for 3 days and was finding it intact. The breeding stock rode in the wagon bed 2 good heifers and a young bull with the broad-shouldered build of something that would be useful when it matured. Any trouble, he asked. She told him about the bull first, that the eucalyptus treatment had worked, that the animal was fully weight-bearing by Wednesday morning, that she'd logged the progression in the record book with notes on what had changed each day and what she'd adjusted in the treatment based on what she saw. She told him the spotted heifer had tested the south fence on Tuesday morning and found the section she'd reinforced on Sunday, which had held, so the heifer had moved to the next span east and gone through that one instead. He looked at her. "I had her back before noon," she said. "I replaced the east span with the extra wire from the second shelf in the lean-to. I used the come-along this time, instead of the fence stretcher, better mechanical advantage on that particular anchor point." She paused. "The heifer knows the fence better than I do. I'm learning it from her." Something moved across his face that was not the measured expression he used for practical information. Closer to what she'd seen the morning after the fire, when he'd looked at her in the yard with the 14 cattle standing behind her. "The pump," he asked, "stuck Wednesday at 6. I heated the housing with the lamp the way you described. Cleared in 10 minutes? He nodded and began unhitching the horses with the fluid efficiency of long practice. She helped with the new animals, getting them settled into the stalls she'd prepared the day before, checking their condition after the journey, noting the younger heifer's tendency to press toward the far wall of an unfamiliar space, which was either temperament or the beginning of something worth watching. That evening he cooked. She came in from the evening check to find him at the stove, venison with root vegetables from the cellar, better than she'd expected, and she said so. He said he'd had a good fall for it. They ate without much additional speech, which was not an absence between them, but a texture, the particular quality of two people who had accumulated enough shared context that silence carried information rather than withholding it. It was afterward, when she was sharpening the farrier's knife at the work table and he was reviewing the ranch ledger at the kitchen table, that she said, "Wade," he looked up. I opened the room at the end of the upstairs hall. She kept her hands moving on the whetstone. The key was in the lock. I don't know if that was intentional. The ledger didn't move, he didn't move. But something in the room changed the way a room changed when a door opened in winter, the sudden arrival of something colder from somewhere it had been kept. I didn't go through it, she said. I opened the door and saw it was Ellen's room, and I looked from the doorway and I left and I closed it again. She set the knife down and turned around. I'm telling you because I said I would be direct with you about things that matter. He was looking at the table. At the ledger, or at something below the surface of the ledger that only he could see. I found the journal, she said more quietly. I didn't read it, but I saw one line. I wasn't trying to. I put it back exactly where it was. He was very still. She was cold, Clara said. Not the weather kind. She wrote when that in February, a month before she died, a long silence. The stove made its sound. Outside, the wind ran along the top of the snow, lifting powder in long pale threads, and the chimney drew cleanly above the stove, the heat going exactly where it was supposed to go. The junction she'd corrected on the first week, doing its work without requiring anyone's attention. And I knew, Wade said. Finally, I knew she was struggling. By October I knew. I kept telling myself she needed more time. That the second winter would be different from the first. His jaw tightened. I was telling myself something easier to believe than the alternative. The alternative being that I'd made a mistake, that I'd been so certain she could manage it because I needed her to manage it. He stopped. Started again at a different angle. Because the alternative meant looking at what I'd actually done to her by being certain. She waited. She needed to leave, he said. By November she needed to leave, and I didn't say it, and she didn't say it, and by February there was nothing left to say because she was sick, and the doctor was 3 days out by road. I got there when I could. He looked at the table. I was there when she died. But I hadn't been there in the way that mattered. Not for months before. The part that's yours is the not asking, Clara said. Not gently, not harshly, the tone she used when naming a structural problem, because that was what this was. Not the winter being hard, not the illness. You didn't see her clearly, and that cost her something she needed. That part belongs to you, she paused. The rest is grief. That part you're allowed to set down. He looked at her with an expression she didn't have a complete category for. Not relief, too complicated for relief. Something with grief in it and something else beneath it. Something that might become, in time, easier to breathe around. Why are you telling me this? He said. Because nobody else has. Because you've been in this house for 4 years carrying the whole weight as if all of it belongs to you, and that's a load distribution problem. It doesn't go in one place without the structure eventually failing. She picked up the knife and went back to the whetstone. You don't have to respond to any of that. I just needed you to have heard it. He was quiet for a long time. Then, toward the end of the evening when the ledger was closed and the lamp had been turned down, thank you. 2 words, spoken at the table, addressed to no one in particular and clearly meant for her. She did not make anything of it. She went to bed and left the kitchen lamp burning low the way she'd started doing, and heard him sit in the quiet for another half hour before the stairs creaked and the house settled into its nighttime sounds. December came on a storm that lasted 4 days and left Sweetwater County under 14 inches. Wade worked from 4 in the morning until dark. Clara worked beside him not as an assistant to his labor, but as someone running her own parallel calculation of what the ranch needed and addressing it without being asked. 14-hour days in cold that had stopped being dramatic and simply become the condition of existence. She learned things about him that the kitchen table hadn't shown her. He was more patient than he appeared. He could spend 40 minutes on a single fence section, unhurried, reworking the tension until it satisfied him in some internal way that she came to recognize as not perfectionism, but precision. There was a difference, and he understood it. He sang under his breath when he thought no one was listening. Not recognizable songs, just melodic patterns he probably didn't know he was making. When a system produced an unexpected result, an animal behaving contrary to established habit, a section of fence holding better than its condition suggested it should. He was genuinely interested in the anomaly, in the way of a person who found the world's refusal to behave predictably more interesting than its compliance. What he was learning about her, she could see it in how his instructions changed. He had stopped explaining structural things in the second week. He had stopped explaining tool use or animal handling or ranch routine in the third. Now he explained terrain, the specific geography of Iron Bell's acreage, the history of which sections had given trouble, in which years, the way the water table moved in spring and what that meant for the lower pasture. He was giving her the knowledge that lived in years of observation. You gave that kind of knowledge only to someone you expected to be present to use it. She noted it. Filed it alongside the fence stretcher in the lean-to and the extra pair of work gloves she'd found on the kitchen table one morning with no explanation and no note. On the afternoon of the fourth storm day, when the snow had stopped and the light was coming through, thin and white and exhausted-looking, Burton Hale's well-maintained bay picked its way up the ranch road. Clara was on the corral rail checking the new heifer's hoof condition. Wade was not back yet from the south pasture. She climbed down and walked to the gate. Hale looked more prepared for winter than last time, a proper coat at least, though the boots still had the clean look of a man who spent most of his days on wooden floors. "'Tis hat, Mrs. Calloway. I was in the area and wanted to check in on how the winter's treating you. We're managing well. Good. He looked past her at the barn, at the rebuilt east wall where the new timber showed pale against the weathered original. I heard about the fire. Fire? Nasty business. But I hear you handled it impressively. The cattle are all fine. He brought his eyes back to her. The eyes were warm in color and not in intent, and she had 6 weeks now to study the distance between those two things. I was hoping to catch both of you. The note situation March isn't far off, and I wanted to give Wade adequate notice that I'd be needing some decisions made. The east parcel specifically. Clara looked at him with the attention she gave to structural drawings when she was looking for the hidden joint, the place where the stress was actually concentrate rather than where the drawing suggested it should be. What specifically about the east parcel, she said. Well, it's the security for the note. If the balance can't be settled by March, then he made a small gesture conveying regret, and the regret was as accurate as his warmth, which was to say it was a very good reproduction of the feeling. The parcel transfers. I'm aware of what the note says. She said it with the steadiness she'd used on contractors who were wrong and knew it. Wade and I will be reviewing the original documents in full before we discuss next steps. Hale's face didn't change, not even slightly. A man surprised showed it somewhere, usually the eyes, usually briefly. Hale showed nothing, which meant he had been expecting this conversation or something close to it. He had come prepared for her to know. Of course, he said. I only wanted to make sure you had adequate time to arrange things. The warm smile, brief, gone. I'll look forward to hearing from Wade. He rode back down the road at the same measured pace he always used, and Clara watched him go with the particular unease of a person who has just confirmed the shape of something they'd been suspecting. The east parcel. She had been documenting the east parcel's boundaries for 6 weeks on her map, noting the soil composition and the rock type in the northeast corner, the way the ground sat different there. A darker, heavy clay, an exposed face of something harder than sandstone showing at the creek cut. She had noticed it because she noticed things. She had not yet understood what she was noticing. She went inside and put on her coat and told Wade when he came in from the pasture, and Wade's jaw set in the way it set when he was adding something to a list of things he was not ready to look at directly. She did not push that night. She went to bed and lay in the dark with the map's northeast corner in her mind, and thought about what kind of rock formation created that particular color of clay and that particular texture of exposed face. Then she got up at 5 in the morning, took her notebook and went to find Elias Drum. December came on a storm that lasted 4 days and left Sweetwater County under 14 inches. Wade worked from 4 in the morning until dark. Clara worked beside him, not as an assistant to his labor, but as someone running her own parallel calculation of what the ranch needed and addressing it. She's learned, across those 4 days, that shared physical hardship built a kind of honesty between people that no amount of conversation could replicate. When you were both too cold and too tired to manage your presentation, you were simply yourself. What she learned about him. He was more patient than he appeared. He could spend 40 minutes on a single fence section, unhurried, reworking the tension until it satisfied some internal standard she was beginning to understand. He sang under his breath when he thought no one was listening, not recognizable songs, just melodic patterns he probably didn't know he was making. When a system produced an unexpected result, he was genuinely interested in the anomaly, in the way of a person who found the world's refusal to behave predictably more interesting than its compliance. What he was learning about her, she could see it in how he explained things. He had stopped explaining structural things in the second week. He had stopped explaining tool use or animal handling or ranch routine in the third. By December, he explained terrain, the history of which sections had given trouble in which years, the way the water table moved in spring, and what that meant for the lower pasture. He was giving her the knowledge that lived in years of observation. You gave that knowledge only to someone you expected to be present long enough to use it. On the afternoon of the 4th storm day, when the snow had stopped and the light was coming through thin and exhausted, Burton Hale's well-maintained bay picked its way up the ranch road. Clara was on the corral rail checking the new heifer's hoof condition. Wade was not back yet from the south pasture. She climbed down and walked to the gate. Hale looked more prepared for winter than last time, a proper coat, though the boots still had the clean look of a man whose days were spent on wooden floors. He tipped his hat and delivered what he had come to deliver in the warm, practiced language of a man who never said the threatening thing directly. The East parcel, the note, March, the specific word transfers arriving at the end of a sentence that had been constructed to make it sound like an administrative fact rather than a declaration of intent. Clara listened. She said Wade, and she would review the original documents together, which was true, and which also communicated that she already knew the documents existed and had formed opinions about them, which was the actual thing she wanted him to know. Hale's face didn't change, which told her he'd been expecting some version of this conversation. He rode back down the road at the same measured pace, and Clara stood at the gate and watched him go. She went inside and put on her coat and her heavier boots, and told the ranch hand she'd be back before dark, and she rode to Caldwell. She went to the county office, first Finch behind his counter, the filing cabinets in their precise order, the particular smell of old paper and official record. She reviewed the survey record from 1876, which she had seen before, and this time she wrote down the full notation about the northeast corner, the precise language Elias had used, the date at the top of the page. She reviewed the transfer record, writing down the transfer date and the amount Hale had paid for the note and the date the bank's failure had been publicly announced. 8 weeks. 8 weeks between the transfer and the public announcement. Then she rode to Elias Drum's house and sat at his table for 40 minutes and came away with what she needed. She rode back to Iron Bell in the growing dark, the numbers and in her head in the sequence they would need to be presented, each one depending on the one before it, the way structural elements depended on each other. Remove one, and the whole arrangement lost its meaning. Wade's horse was in the barn when she got back. She put her own horse up and went inside. He was in the kitchen, his coat still on, standing at the work table with his hands flat on the surface and his back to the door. He turned when she came in. His face was doing the controlled thing, the jaw set. The expression evened out that she had learned meant something had moved through him, and he was deciding what to show of it. Finch at the county office mentioned you'd been in, he said. So that was how. Caldwell was a small town, and Finch talked to people, which was his prerogative and also she recognized entirely predictable. She should have predicted it. I also went to Elias Drum, she said. And before that you were at Hale's bank, he said it evenly. But the evenness was itself information, the specific flatness of a man working hard to keep something in its lane. I came back through town. I saw you coming out. I was not in Hale's bank, she said. I was at the county office. He looked at her. The county office is 2 doors down from Hale's building, she said. I came out of the county office. I've never set foot in Hale's bank. A long pause. The specific silence of a fan recalibrating something he'd been certain about for the last 2 hours. You thought I was meeting with Hale, she said. He said nothing. You thought I was giving him something. She kept her voice fully level, not angry, not reproachful, but naming the thing precisely so it couldn't be unnamed again. Or getting something from him. Money, maybe. A way back to St. Louis. Clara, I'm not angry, she said. I understand what it looked like. I understand that you have a history that makes that particular calculation available to you. She held his gaze. But I need you to know what you were looking at, because if we're going to do what I think we need to do, you can't be running that calculation about me in the background. I can't work alongside someone who is still deciding whether I'm trustworthy. He stood at the work table and looked her with the expression that had been coming to the surface with increasing frequency over the past 2 months, the one underneath the controlled face, the one that cost us something to show. You're right, he said. I was wrong to assume. You weren't wrong to look, she said. You were wrong about what you saw. He nodded once, in the manner of a man accepting a correction that was precisely calibrated and could not be argued with. What did you find? She sat down at the table and told him everything. Ellis's survey, the visitors in the fall of 1876 with clean boots and specific questions. The transfer record, the 8 weeks. The full pattern of it, laid out in the order that made the meaning clear. He stood at the work table and listened with the focused stillness of a man who was receiving information he had been, at some level, bracing for. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. I need to see the original note, she said. The one your father signed, not the renewal. The original, it's in the drawer of the pantry. I know where it is. I've known since the 2nd week. She met his eyes. It wasn't mine to open without your knowledge. It is now. Whatever is in there concerns the land I'm responsible for. He went to the drawer, the one with the slightly sticky pull, and came back with the tin box. He set it on the table between them, sat down. I haven't read the original, he said. When my father signed it, I was 22. When I renewed it in April of 79, I couldn't. He stopped. I wasn't reading documents carefully in April of 79. She understood what April of 79 had been. Ellen had died in February. She did not say this. She simply put her hand on the box and said, "We read it now." He opened it. The original note was straightforward, clear terms, specific numbers. The security clause pledging Iron Bell's operations broadly without specifying any particular parcel. The renewal document was different. Clara read the security clause twice, then a 3rd time, the way she read structural drawings when something didn't match. The language around the east parcel was not in the same hand as the surrounding text. The ink was a slightly different shade, not dramatically, but different in the way a practiced eye caught it, the way you caught a repair in old timber by the color rather than the grain. The sentence construction was unlike every other clause in both documents, and the clause itself was not a refinement of the original security terms. It was a replacement of them designating the east parcel specifically and exclusively, removing the broader operational pledge that had been there from the beginning. Wade, she said. He looked up from the document. This clause was added after your father's original terms. After the bank transferred the note to Hale, she pointed to the section without touching it. The handwriting is different. The ink is different. The legal construction is different from every other term in both documents. He looked at where she pointed. He looked at it for a long time. Someone altered it, he said. Someone who knew what was under the east parcel and needed a specific legal instrument to claim it. The kitchen was quite quiet except for the stove and the wind outside, and the corrected chimney drawing cleanly above them, the heat going exactly where it was supposed to go. I should have, Wade said. The flat tone of a man arriving at a conclusion about himself that he had been avoiding. In April. I should have read every word before I signed it. You were in April of 79, she said. You were where you were. What we do with it now is what matters. He looked at the document and then at her, at the map she'd been building since October, at the record book on the work table, at the leather case she'd bought for the legal documents she'd been accumulating, at hers, sitting across the table from him in the December dark, having spent the afternoon building the case she was now handing him. I thought you were meeting with Hale, he said again. Quit her. Not defending it, examining it, I know. That was the first thing I went to. He looked at the table. Not you being capable of something I hadn't considered? Not you doing what you've been doing since October without being asked? I went straight to the category. The category you had before I arrived, she said. Yes, that category was wrong, she said. You know that now, I knew it before tonight, he said. I just didn't know I was still using it until I saw you on the street and felt certain I knew what I was seeing. He met her eyes. That's mine, I'm sorry. 3 words, specific and clean. She received them the way she received precise things directly, without deflecting them into something smaller now, she said. What do we do with what's in the document? He straightened in his chair. The thing that had been wound tight in him for the last 2 hours released not with relief exactly, but with the quality of a person who has been carrying something incorrectly and has been shown the right way to hold it. We take it to Judge Cross before Hale takes it to him first. We bring the survey records, she said. The transfer date and the bank failure date. The gap between them. We bring Elias Drum. He'll go, she said. He told me his survey records were public record and any property owner had the right to review them. That's a man telling you what he's prepared to do in a room. Wade looked at the documents and the map side by side on the table. The coal measure notation in her handwriting. The altered clause in someone else's. The dates across the top of her notebook, page 1876, 1878, 1879, in order, each one resting on the one before it. You went to Elias without telling me, he said. Yes. And to the county office, she held his gaze. I needed to understand the full shape of it before I asked you to look at it with me. I should have told you I was going. That part I would do differently. Not the going, he said. Not the going, she confirmed. He looked at her for a moment, the real look, the one without management in it. We need to write down everything we know and in what order we know it, he said. So that when we stand in front of someone and say it, we say it in the right sequence. She got the notebook. He got paper for his own notes. The lamp between them threw its steady light across the documents and the map, and the two of them settling in for the work. And outside, Iron Bell Ranch sat in the December dark with its east parcel and its altered document and its corrected chimney. And the spotted heifer was quiet in her stall for once, which was either exhaustion or the fact that the fence she'd been testing all month had finally earned her respect. They worked until the lamp oil ran low. Then they went to bed and slept, because the work continued in the morning, and the morning came regardless. March came without apology. February at least had the decency to be visibly brutal. You could see what February was doing and brace accordingly. March arrived looking like it might be reasonable, and then changed its mind at noon on any given day, coming down off the mountains with the vindictiveness of a season that had made promises and decided they were optional. 2 feet of new snow on the second Monday, a thaw that turned the ranch road to cold soup by Thursday. Ice on the creek Saturday morning that hadn't been there Friday night. Clara had been watching the road to Caldwell since the first week of the month, not with anxiety, with the particular alertness of someone who has done all available preparation and is now measuring the distance between readiness and the thing itself. Hale had not come by since December. He had not sent word. He was doing what a man did when he had a legal mechanism working in his favor and time running out for the other party, letting the clock do the work. Why ride out in March mud when March itself was doing his job for him? Wade knew it too. She could see it in the set of his shoulders when he came in from morning rounds and looked at the calendar and said nothing. They had stopped needing to narrate certain things to each other. The knowledge passed between them in other ways now, the angle of a look, the way one of them picked up what the other had set down without being asked. 5 months of working the same ground had built a shorthand that neither of them had designed. It had accumulated the way all knowledge accumulated through repetition and proximity and the daily pressure of shared consequence. On the 3rd of March, Wade came in from the barn and said, I sent word to Judge Cross yesterday. Asked for a formal town meeting hearing on the 3rd Saturday. Cross said he'd be there. Clara looked up from the notebook. 3rd Saturday of March the 15th. 12 days, I told Agnes, he added. She understood what that meant. Agnes Polk had been told, which meant Sweetwater Valley had been told, which meant by nightfall the information would exist in the shared atmosphere of the valley and not only in a tin box on a kitchen table. It meant the shape of what they were doing had become public, and therefore real in a way that private knowledge never quite was. Hale will hear by noon, she said. He'll hear by noon, Wade confirmed. He looked at the map still pinned to the wall, the northeast corner with its notations, and then at the documents on the table. He has the advantage. He has 4 years and a legal instrument in the silence of a man who couldn't look at the thing clearly enough to fight it. He looked at her. That's done. She held his gaze. This was not the man who had stood at Caldwell Station in October with the careful distance of someone who had decided not to need anyone and had become very good at maintaining the decision. Something had shifted across the months of working side by side, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way foundations shifted when the load they were built for finally arrived. He was carrying it correctly now, distributed across the whole structure instead of concentrated in one hidden joint. 12 days, she said. 12 days, he confirmed. She opened the notebook. Then we work. They spent 3 evenings on the sequence. Not the fact she had those memorized by mid-January, the dates and amounts and legal language sitting in her mind the way structural drawings sat, accessible from any angle. They worked on the order. The way you presented a case was as important as the case itself. You built it the way you built a structure from the foundation up, each element resting on the one before it. Nothing introduced before the thing it depended on was already in place. Original note and its terms, transfer record and its date, bank failure date and what the gap between those 2 dates implied, Elias Drum's survey and the date of it, Hale's visit to Elias and the date of that, the renewal document and the clause that had no business being in it, the coal measure and why a man would go to considerable trouble to acquire a specific piece of land with a specific kind of rock formation under it. Each evening Wade said, "Tell me the sequence," and she told it, and he listened the way he listened to things he needed to carry in his body before he could use them. And at the end he asked questions that sharpened the weak points, and she revised and they started again. The work was not romantic. It was the kind of focused, unglamorous effort that either worked or didn't, and they would find out which on a Saturday in a hall with 43 people in it. On the 7th evening, Elias Drum came by, unannounced. On the horse she hadn't known he still kept. He came in and sat at the kitchen table and drank the coffee she put in front of him and looked at the documents spread across the table with the eyes of a man confirming what he already knew was there. "I want to see the survey record," he said. "My copy. To make sure it matches what's at the county office." She brought the transcript she'd made at Finch's counter in December. Elias compared the 2 documents line by line, unhurried, his finger moving across the page with the precision of a man who had measured things for a living and understood that precision was not optional. "They match," he said. "I know they match," she said. He looked at her over the top of the papers. "I know you know. I needed to confirm it for myself." He folded his copy and put it in his coat pocket. "I'll be there Saturday. So I'll say what I know and I'll say it under my own name in front of whoever's in that room." He looked at Wade. "Your father was a good man. He trusted the wrong institution and the wrong person who acquired the institution. That's not a character failure. It's an error of judgment in a situation that was designed to look trustworthy." Wade said nothing. But something in his face settled not with relief exactly, more with the quality of a thing finding the position it had been looking for. Elias finished his coffee and rode back into the March dark. Clara stood at the back door and watched his lantern swing away down the road until it was a small warm point in all that cold darkness, and then nothing. She went back inside and told Wade, "We're ready." He was already looking at the sequence notes. "We're ready," he agreed. The morning of the town meeting was the kind of March morning Wyoming produced when it felt like acknowledging that winter had limits, cold but clear, the mountains white and sharp against a sky that was the particular blue of something recently washed. Clara dressed in kitchen before first light, the stove already going, the coffee already made. She wore the dark wool she'd bought in Caldwell in November, practical and clean, and she put her hair up with the same pins she used every day. She was not dressing for the occasion in the way that the occasion was theatrical. She was dressing for work. Wade came downstairs at 5:30 and they ate breakfast without discussing what they were about to do, because there was nothing left to discuss. The documents were in the leather case she'd bought for the purpose. The map was rolled and tied. Her notebook held the sequence in clean handwriting on 3 pages. Elias was meeting them at the hall. They rode to Caldwell in the wagon, 18 miles of March road, the thaw making the surface soft in places and the cold making it hard in others, unpredictable under the wheels. She held the leather case on her lap. Wade held the reins with the same loose, deliberate grip he always used. They said very little, which was not the silence of two people who had nothing to say, but the silence of two people who had said everything that needed to saying and were now simply getting to where the saying had been building toward. The Caldwell Town Hall was a room that had been designed for pragmatic purposes and had over 20 years acquired the personality of a space that had absorbed a great deal of human nature in compressed form. The walls had heard arguments and agreements and the sound of men deciding things by vote or shouted consensus. On the third Saturday of March, with snow still heavy on the roof and both iron stoves burning at full capacity, it held 43 people who had made the ride or walked to Caldwell despite Saturday's competing demands. Clara counted them when she came in, 43. She counted the way she counted fence posts and water intervals automatically. For the informations, she and Wade sat at the front table on the left of the center aisle. Across from them, at the right table, Burton Hale, in a vest that had been pressed since the last time she'd seen him he had received the news, understood what it meant and dressed accordingly, and a lawyer from Laramie whose name was Whitmore, with a document bag too large for its contents and the confident posture of a man who had been winning these proceedings long enough that the confidence was structural rather than felt. Judge Emmett Cross sat at the center table with the authority of a man who had been doing this since before Wyoming was a territory and had developed, purely through the angle of his chin and the steadiness of his gaze, the ability to communicate that he was not going to tolerate theater from anyone in the room today. Elias Drum sat in the second row on the left, in a clean coat and the hat he saved for Sundays, his hands on his knees, the stillness of a man at rest with his conscience. Agnes Polk sat in the third row, center, with Madar on her right and Josephine Hatch on her left, the three of them together with the quality of a bench placed in that position deliberately. Cross called the proceeding to order with a single knock of the wooden mallet. "We're here on the matter of a promissory note held by Mr. Burton Hale against Iron Bell Ranch, Sweetwater County. Note comes due this month. The Callaways have requested formal review. Mr. Hale, present the instrument. Mr. Callaway, you'll have equal time to respond." Whitmore stood. His voice had the practiced resonance of a man who understood that resonance communicated authority before words arrived. He presented the note, the renewal, the clause, the security, the mathematical clarity of a debt that had come due and a piece of land pledged against it. He did this cleanly, without excess, because excess would have suggested uncertainty, and Whitmore did not project uncertainty. When he sat down, the room held the specific weight of 43 people who had been presented with a legal argument they could not immediately counter. Cross looked at Wade. "Mr. Callaway." Wade stood. 7 minutes, level and unhurried, the voice of a man who had been on this land for 12 years and was going to say what he knew about it without decoration. He described his father's original note and its terms. He described the renewal he'd signed in April 1879, and his state of mind in April 1879, which he said plainly and without asking for sympathy. "My wife had died 6 weeks before and I signed something that had been altered from the original terms, and I am here to demonstrate that alteration." He put the original note on the table beside the renewal and indicated the clause. He indicated the difference in language. Then he looked at Clara and sat down. She stood. The sound that moved through the room was not loud, not hostile, the rustle and shift of 43 people recalibrating, adjusting their attention towards something they hadn't expected. She recognized it. She had heard it at contractor meetings at the architectural firm, the sound of a room encountering a thing that wasn't supposed to be there and deciding what to do about it. She had been not expected before. It had never changed the load-bearing properties of what she had to say. "My name is Clara Callaway," she said. The tone she used for structural problems even, direct, neither apologetic nor aggressive. "I've been at Iron Bell Ranch since October. I want to show you the sequence of events that explains why the clause in the renewal document exists and what it was designed to accomplish." She put the map on the table, her notebook beside it. The transfer record from the county office. Elias Drum surveyed the northeast corner of Iron Bell's east parcel in September 1876. Her eyes moved through the room, not fixing on Hale, not performing for anyone, delivering information in its correct order. The survey found a coal measure in that corner. 40 feet below the surface at the creek face, running northeast-southwest. The survey record has been at the Sweetwater County office since 1876. It is a public record. Anyone in this room can read it. Whitmore was on his feet, Your Honor. This proceeding concerns a debt instrument. Not Cross raised one finger, just one. Whitmore sat. The survey was completed in September 1876, Clara continued. In the fall of that same year, Elias Drum received a visitor asking specific questions about the mineral composition of several Vauvert parcels, specifically the northeast corner of Iron Bell's east parcel. She paused. Mr. Drum is present in this room and will confirm that account under his own name. She heard the shift in the room's attention, felt it move from the front tables to the second row, where Elias sat with his hands on his knees and his Sunday hat, and the stillness of someone who had been waiting a specific number of years for this particular moment. Sweetwater Territorial Bank held Amos Calloway's original note, she said. The bank failed in October 1878. She put the transfer record on the table. 8 weeks before that failure was publicly known, Burton Hale purchased the note from the bank for less than half its face value. The purchase date is in this document. The bank failure date is in the territorial record. She kept her voice even the tone of someone reading numbers off a gauge rather than making an argument. I am noting the timeline. The timeline speaks for itself. It did. She could feel it speak. She could feel the room receive it. The original note, the one Amos Calloway signed, the one Wade Calloway renewed in 1879, did not contain a clause designating the east parcel as exclusive security. The renewal document, prepared under Mr. Hale's ownership of the note, does contain that clause. She pointed to the document without touching it. The clause is not in the same hand as the surrounding text. The ink is a different age. The legal construction differs from every other term in both the original and the renewal. She looked at the room steadily. I drafted structural drawings for 4 years. I know when a thing has been added by a different hand at a different time. The room was very quiet, not the polite quiet of people waiting for the next item. The particular quiet of 43 people who have had something reorganized in their understanding and are sitting in the new arrangement of it. Hale was looking at her. The warm smile had been gone for several minutes. What was underneath it was harder in its lines and more precise in its attention, and she looked back at it without moving. Drum. Cross said. Elias stood. He moved to the front of the room with the deliberate pace of his years and the specific authority of a man who had measured land for a living and knew that precision was the thing itself, not a courtesy you extended to it. He confirmed the survey. He confirmed the date. He confirmed the visitor who had come to him in the fall of 1876, a well-dressed man with clean boots who had asked specific questions about specific parcels and had expressed specific interest in the mineral composition of a specific corner. Can you identify that visitor? Cross asked. Elias looked at Hale. A long, direct look. The look of a man who had been carrying a specific knowledge for a specific number of years and had decided today that he was done carrying it alone. Yes, he said. The sound that went through the room then was not a sound exactly. It was the collective exhale of 43 people releasing something they hadn't known they'd been holding. Whitmore deployed everything available to him the years since the survey, the reliability of aged memory, the procedural limitations of a county hearing. He was good at his job and he was thorough about it. Cross listened with the patience of a man whose patience was itself a form of authority, the patience of someone who was going to hear everything and then decide, and whose decision was going to be the decision. He let Whitmore finish. Then he looked at Hale directly. Mr. Hale, do you deny visiting Mr. Drum in the fall of 1876? Hale's face was composed, controlled, the polished surface that had been his consistent presentation at every Iron Bell gate and every Caldwell Street corner, in every warm smile and every carefully shaped sentence. I visit many people in the course of conducting business across this county, Judge. I couldn't speak to specific conversations from 18 years past, not a denial. Everyone in the room understood it was not a denial. Cross looked at the documents. He looked at the clause. He looked at the transfer date and the bank failure date and the gap between them. He looked at Elias Drum standing at the front of the room with his Sunday hat and his survey records, and the absolute solidity of a man who had measured that land with his own instruments and knew what was under it. He looked at Clara last. Brief. The specific look of an older person offering a younger one, something that didn't have a simple name recognition perhaps, of a kind that included both what had been done and what it had cost to do it. The renewal instrument contains material alterations not present in the original note, Cross said. The clause designating the East parcel as exclusive security is not binding without a signed addendum from the original note holder, which was Sweetwater Territorial Bank, not Mr. Hale at the time of the original signing. Mr. Hale's purchase of the note confers the debt obligation. It does not confer the right to revise the instrument's terms after acquisition. He set his mallet on the table with the finality of a man who had been making decisions for 30 years and was comfortable with the weight of this one. The East parcel security designation is void. The underlying debt obligation stands and will be settled by the Callaways within 60 days at the original agreed rate. He looked at Hale with the steady attention of a man who had been waiting for the right occasion. I'll also be reviewing the other note transfers from Sweetwater Territorial Bank that passed through your hands, Mr. Hale. In light of today's presentation, Whitmore started to say something. Cross raised a finger. Whitmore closed his mouth. The room exhaled again, all 43 at once, and this time it sounded like something concluding, like a structure that had been braced against collapse finally being permitted to stand on its own. Agnes Pope. From the third row, in a voice calibrated for exactly the radius she intended and not 1 inch further. She knew what she was doing when she came here. Clara was rolling the map back into its case. She kept her hands moving on the ties and didn't look up, but she heard it land in the room the way Agnes's statements always landed, not loud, not performative, simply accurate and therefore permanent. The kind of thing that would still be true in 10 years when people in Sweetwater Valley talked about the third Saturday in March of 1884. Outside on the Caldwell Street after, in the cold and the mud and the March afternoon that had decided to be almost decent for the occasion, the 43 people separated and reconstituted in smaller groups the way people did after a shared event, processing, comparing, beginning to establish the version that would travel outward from this afternoon into the valley's long memory. Clara stood at the edge of the board sidewalk with the leather case in her hands and felt the particular sensation of having done the thing and not yet knowing how to stand in the aftermath of it. Not triumphant, not relieved. Something more specific and harder to name, the sensation of having been accurately useful in a situation where accuracy mattered, which was the closest thing to satisfaction she had ever found reliable. Josephine Hatch came to stand beside her. She looked straight ahead at the street, not at Clara, in the way of someone who had something to say and was going to say it without making it larger than it needed to be. I have a note with Hale. Different terms, but the same bank history. She paused. I didn't know about any of this until today. Cross said he's reviewing the transfers, Clara said. If yours came through the same channel, can I bring you the document? Clara looked at her. 28 years old, running a claim alone, standing in March mud asking a practical question without any of the hedging that the question might be treated. Yes, she said. Bring it Thursday. Josephine nodded and walked away. Clara watched her go and thought, there are others. Hale had been doing this for a while, and the other cases were still in drawers and tin boxes in the specific paralysis that came from looking at a thing that had cost you something to sign, and not knowing yet that you were allowed to fight it. That was going to be different work from rebuilding a barn or correcting a chimney, but it was going to be work, and she noticed this without surprise, not burdened by the idea of it. Interested, rather. The way she had been interested in the spotted heifer's fence testing and the bull's respiratory complaint and the kitchen garden drainage. Because problems that had solutions were not problems to be dreaded but situations to be addressed, and the addressing was where the real information lived. May Doer appeared at her other elbow. Your kitchen garden drainage problem, May said. The one that runs toward the foundation. Clara blinked. Yes, I had the same problem at our place for 8 years. What finally worked, and May Doer proceeded to describe a specific grading solution using flat stones and compacted gravel at a particular angle, standing in the March mud outside the Caldwell Town Hall, as if this was the most natural continuation of the afternoon's events. Which, Clara thought it was. This was how Sweetwater Valley worked. The town meeting ended and the valley's actual business continued, practical and specific and conducted wherever two people happened to be standing. She listened and asked 2 questions and pulled out her notebook and wrote down the stone dimensions and the grade angle. May watched her write with the expression of a woman who approved of writing things down. Wade came out of the hall then, moving through the dispersing crowd with the ease of a man who knew this community and was known by it, and he looked at her at the edge of the sidewalk with May Dorr. Notebook out, writing something down. And something in his face did what it did sometimes when he was looking at her without having prepared an expression for it. She had started to understand what that unguarded look contained. She had been understanding it incrementally since October, one additional element at a time, and she was getting a clearer picture of the whole. Hay crossed to where she was standing, May Dorr, with the instinct of a woman who understood when her presence was the third element in a 2-person situation, said she needed to find Ruth Ingram and walked away with the directness of someone who has completed the exchange they came for. Wade stood beside Clara in the March afternoon and looked at the Caldwell Street, the empty building that had been Hale's bank. The hotel, the general store where Agnes Polk was already back behind her counter, the mountains visible at the end of the street running south, white and certain in the afternoon light. "You were the one who needed to say it," he said. "You built it with me. You knew where every piece went. I knew the land and the history. You knew how to make it into something a room full of people could follow." He looked at her. "That's not the same thing." She thought about the contractor meetings at the architectural firm, the ones where she had sat at the table with her drawings and watched men twice her age receive the information she'd prepared and present it as if they'd developed it themselves, and how she had learned to be strategic about visibility, to choose when to be seen and when to be the person who made the visible person's work possible. She had been strategic about it for 4 years because she'd had no alternative. Here she'd had an alternative, and he had given it to her deliberately, not because it was efficient, but because he had understood that it needed to be hers. "Thank you," she said. He looked slightly uncomfortable with being thanked for this, in the way he was sometimes uncomfortable with acknowledgement of things he'd done that he thought were simply correct, which was itself something she had come to understand about him, that he did not perform decency. He simply kept practiced it, and being noticed practicing it flustered him in a way that being noticed doing hard physical work never did. "Come on," she said. 18 miles home and the road isn't getting better in the dark. Ruth Ingram's husband John came the following week with a document that had the same alterations in a different clause. Clara read it at the kitchen table and confirmed what she'd found, and told John Ingram what to bring to Cross's office, and he left with the specific purposeful stride of a man who had spent months not knowing he was allowed to fight something and had just been told that he was. A rancher and pianista from the north end of the valley sent a letter asking if she would look at something Hale's bank had sent him in 1881. She wrote back and said to bring it on Saturday. He came and she read it and found nothing wrong. It was clean, genuinely clean, and she told him so. He looked at her as if this information was also, somehow, valuable, which she understood. Knowing a thing was sound was as important as knowing it was compromised. You couldn't make decisions about a structure without accurate information about what it was actually doing. Josephine Hatch came on Thursday as agreed, with a note that had the same altered clause structure and a transfer record that showed the same pattern, Hale acquiring the instrument weeks before public knowledge of the bank's failure. Clara worked through it methodically at the kitchen table with Josephine sitting across from her watching the process, and afterward Josephine said, "How did you know what to look for?" "I knew what the alteration was trying to accomplish," Clara said. "Once you know what a thing is designed to do, you can find where it does it." Josephine looked at the documents and then at Clara's map on the wall and then at the record book open on the work table. "I'd like to learn how to read these," she said. "The documents. The way you read them." Clara looked at her for a moment. 28, running a claim alone, asking to be taught a skill that would make her harder to cheat. "Come back Wednesday," she said. "Bring whatever documents you have related to the claim. We'll start from the beginning." Josephine came back Wednesday, and the Wednesday after. By the end of March, she could read a legal instrument security clause and identify the load-bearing language, the terms that actually mattered versus the terms that were decorative. She was not as fast as Clara yet, but she was accurate, which was the thing that mattered. Judge Cross sent letters to 2 other counties regarding the Hale note transfers. 3 weeks after the town meeting, he wrote out to Iron Bell himself, which was unusual. Cross did not usually make ranch calls. He sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and reviewed the 3 altered instruments Clara had found in the valley with the expression of a man who was not surprised and was also not satisfied about not being surprised. "It's good work," he said when he was done reviewing. "The sequence is airtight. The county attorney in Laramie is going to want to talk to you." "I'll be available," she said. He looked at her over the rim of the cup. "I'm going to ask you something directly. Please do. Where did you learn to do this?" "I learned to read structural drawings," she said. "A document is a structure. It has load-bearing elements and decorative elements and weak points and the places where the stress is actually concentrated rather than where it appears to be. Once you can read one kind of structure, the method transfers." Cross looked at her for a long moment with the appraising attention of a man deciding something. "There's going to be more work like this in this county," he said. Hale wasn't the only one who understood that the territorial period created opportunities for this kind of instrument manipulation. He was just the most systematic about it. "I know," she said. "Would you be willing?" She thought about Mr. Devers saying it's a shame there's no future in it for you here, and about Thomas's debts, and about $4.70, and about standing on a train platform in St. Louis with a contract on her lap thinking about sound constitution. She thought about the spotted heifer pressing the south fence and the bull with the respiratory complaint and the kitchen garden drainage and the corrected chimney and the post that had needed to move 2 feet. She thought about Josephine Hatch sitting across the kitchen table learning to read legal language with the focused intensity of someone who understood the stakes. "Yes," she said. Cross finished his coffee. At the door he paused and looked back at her, at the map on the wall and the record book and the leather case on the shelf where she kept the documents for the cases she was working through. "Iron Bell is lucky to have you," he said. "Iron Bell is lucky to have both of us," she said. "Wade built this ranch. I'm helping him keep it." Cross made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was adjacent to one and walked out to his horse. She watched him go from the doorway, and when he was out of sight she went back inside and put the kettle on and picked up the next document in the stack. Josephine had left on Wednesday. Hale left Caldwell in May, not dramatically. He closed the bank, transferred what could be transferred, and took the East train on a Tuesday morning with 3 trunks, and the speed of a man whose calculation about remaining options had reached a number he didn't like. Cross's letters to the other counties had produced results. The territorial attorney's office in Laramie had produced results. Hale's particular method of acquiring instruments against land that had something under it had produced, at last, the kind of result that made continuation impractical. The first Sweetwater Bank building stood empty on the Caldwell Main Street for 6 weeks. Agnes Polk found a buyer by the end of June, a man named Orchard, who wanted to run a dry goods warehouse and who, within a week of opening, had established a commercial relationship with Agnes's store that was mutually advantageous and involved no altered legal instruments of any kind. The 60-day settlement deadline came in May. Wade paid the original balance from the cash reserve he'd been building for 3 years, not because he'd known exactly what shape the need would take, but because the note had always been weight on the operation, and he had always understood, at some level he hadn't been able to look at directly, that eventually there would be a reckoning with it. He handed Clara the receipt from the county office, and she looked at it and held it for a moment, not the document itself, but what the document represented, which was Iron Bell's East parcel belonging to Iron Bell completely, without qualification, without a clause inserted by someone else's hand into someone else's moment of grief. She put it in the tin box. He put the tin box in the drawer. The drawer stuck. She made a mental note and fixed it the following morning before breakfast, planing the edge of the facing down 2 millimeters. And it slid clean ever after. Summer came to Sweetwater Valley with the specific generosity of a thing that knows what it's following. The herd grew according to the plan she'd drawn in February, when the documents had covered the kitchen table and she'd needed something productive to do with the part of her attention that wasn't devoted to legal sequence. The northwest rotation worked exactly as she'd mapped it. The Eastfield water source went in during late May, a 3-day project, cold water to her knees on the second afternoon while she adjusted a stone culvert weighed on the bank behind her with opinions about the methodology. He finished the adjustment, and the culvert held through June's first rain and every rain afterward, and Wade told her on a Thursday morning in July, without preamble, that she'd been right about the culvert. She said thank you. They went on with the morning. She and Wade disagreed about the spring rotation timing twice, with genuine heat, the kind of disagreement that required two people who both knew what they were talking about, and had arrived at different conclusions from the same information. She won the first disagreement on its merits. He won the second, about the timing for the Southwest pasture rest period, and she had the specific satisfaction of being argued correctly out of a position she'd held past the point the evidence supported. He laughed more that summer than he had in the months before. Not frequently, not loudly, but with the quality of a thing unlocked rather than manufactured, a sound that had always been present in him and was now being given its appropriate occasions. On an evening in late July, she came in from the barn to find him at the kitchen table with the Emerson open, reading aloud to himself. He looked up when she came in. "My father's," he said. "I know." He thought Emerson was the most practical writer who ever lived, which probably tells you something about my father. It tells me he was right. Emerson is practical self-reliance as a structural principle. You build the thing yourself, on ground you understand, with tools you've learned, then it holds. He wrote it like philosophy. It's actually engineering. Wade looked at the book in his hands. Self-reliance as a structural principle, he repeated. The structure being yourself, your own judgment, your own assessment of what the load requires. She sat down across from him. The rest of the philosophy follows from that. He'd have liked you, Wade said. My father, I think I'd have liked him. He would have asked you about your fence post technique in the first 10 minutes and not come up for air for an hour. That's a recommendation, she said. He almost laughed, the almost version that was itself a complete thing. Outside, Iron Bell sat in the July evening, the cattle settled in the rotation she'd planned, the east field trough running clean. Josephine Hatch had come to Iron Bell every Wednesday since late March, working through the legal documents related to her claim with the focused intensity of someone who understood the stakes. She could now read a security clause and identify the load-bearing language, the terms that actually mattered, versus the terms that were decorative. 3 weeks into April, she had stopped asking Clara what a phrase meant and started telling her what she thought it meant and asking if she was right, which was the change that indicated something real had been learned. 2 other Valley ranchers had come with documents in April and May. One instrument Clara had found clean, genuinely clean, and she'd told the rancher so, and he'd looked at her as if this information was also, somehow, valuable, which she understood. Knowing a thing was sound was as pot as knowing it was compromised. Judge Cross had ridden out to Iron Bell himself in late May, which was unusual. He sat at the kitchen table and reviewed the 3 altered instruments Clara had found in the valley and said the county attorney in Laramie would want to talk to her. She said she'd be available. At the door he paused and said it was good work. She said it was arithmetic. He made a sound that was adjacent to a laugh and rode back to Caldwell. And she went back to the document on her work table because the morning wasn't finished. On an August morning, early before Wade was up, Clara sat at the kitchen table with her notebook open to the spring expansion plan. Her hand came to rest on her stomach without her directing it there. She noticed where her hand was. She counted backward. She sat with the count for a moment, let it be a number, let the number mean what it meant, and did not rush any of those steps. Then she put the kettle on. She stood at the window while the water heated and looked at Iron Bell Ranch in the early August light, the barn, with the new timber on the east section, the south fence line running tight and level to the creek, the east field water source, the cattle distributed across the pasture in the pattern she'd planned. All of it visible from here, all of it hers in the way that things became yours through the work of them, not through the paper that said so. Wheat came in from the barn at 5:30, the morning check having gone quickly. He looked at her at the window, at the kettle. At her again. I need to tell you something, she said. He stopped with his coat halfway off the peg. Come spring, she said. Iron Bell is going to have one more person in it. He stood still for a moment that was longer than a breath and shorter than anything that could be measured in words. Then he took his coat off the peg and hung it, walked across the kitchen, and sat down in the chair beside her, not across the table, beside her, so that when he put his hand on the table, and she put hers over it, they were looking out the same window at the same morning. "Clara," he said, just that. Her name in his voice with everything that had accumulated around it since October, sitting in the 2 syllables, the chimney and the barn plans, and the fire, and the 14 cattle, and the map on the wall, and the document on the table, and the town meeting, and the evenings with the Emerson, and every silence they had built and been built by. "I know," she said. Outside, the spotted heifer pressed the south fence, found it sound and went back to her grass. October came back. 1 year from the afternoon, the Union Pacific had put her on a platform in Caldwell, with a navy dress and an ivory ribboned hat and $4.70, and the uncertainty of a person who has made a decision and does not yet know what the decision will cost. She was at the northeast fence line in the early morning, walking the perimeter the way she walked it twice a week. Her coat was the heavy canvas she'd bought in December. Her boots were the 3rd pair she'd owned at Iron Bell, the previous 2 having given their full measure to the work. The hat was a rancher's hat, wide-brimmed and practical. The ivory ribbon hat sat on the shelf in her room, slightly singed at the brim, accurate and complete. The baby had made itself known, had been making itself known since August, and she had adjusted the work around it with the same practical logic she applied to any structural challenge. You learned what the new load distribution required, and you adapted. The morning rounds took longer. The barn work had shifted. The document work at the kitchen table had not changed at all. She stood at the northeast corner and looked at the land past the fence, the east parcel running to the tree line, the dark clay soil, the creek cut where the rock face showed its banded surface, the whole corner of Iron Bell Ranch sitting exactly as it had always sat, unchanged by the 18 months of legal contest over it. She heard the gate behind her. She didn't turn immediately. She stood and looked at the northeast corner and let herself simply be in it, the cold, the October light coming over the mountains at its low, specific angle, the sound of the creek running clear, the cattle somewhere south making their ordinary morning sounds, Wade's footsteps on the frost-hard ground. She turned. He was carrying 2 cups. Because it was morning and the coffee was ready and he had come out to where she was, which was what he did now. He handed her the cup. She took it with both hands and felt the warmth move through the wool of her gloves. "Cold this morning," he said. "October," she said. They stood at the northeast corner with their coffee and the mountains behind them, carrying the first snow of the year on their high faces. The sky the particular blue of something that has finished apologizing for what came before it and is now simply itself. She looked out at the land, all of it visible from here, the east pasture with the water source running, the cattle in the morning light, the roof of the barn showing its 2 timbers side by side, the house with its south-facing windows open to the morning. "What are you thinking?" Wade said. She thought about what she was actually thinking. "I'm thinking about the first morning," she said, "when I walked the barn and found your plans on the wall. How I stood in front of them and saw the post position problem and thought, I know how to fix this. I know exactly how to fix this." She looked at the mountains. That was the first time since Thomas died that I'd thought that about anything. Not about the ranch specifically. About anything. The feeling of looking at a problem and knowing you have the capability to address it. "You circled it in red," he said. "You could see it from 10 feet away. I needed to see it from 10 feet away." The dry quality she'd come to know as his version of humor, quieter than most people's and easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. "I'd been looking at that drawing for 3 weeks. You were looking at the whole thing. You needed someone to show you where the single problem was." He turned toward her. Not the inventory look from the station platform. Not the measured look from the barn plans. Not even the careful look he'd used through November and December while he was still deciding what to let himself know about her. The look underneath all of those. The one that had been coming to the surface since the night they'd sat with the documents, since the town meeting, since the August morning at the kitchen window. Just his face in the October light, tired and honest and not managing anything. "Clara," he said. "I know," she said. "I want to say it, then say it." He looked at her with the expression of a man who has decided to do the difficult thing correctly and is committing to it. "I had an arrangement with you, a contract. Practical terms for a practical situation, and I want to ask you something outside all of that." He held her gaze. Do you want to be here? Not at Iron Bell, no. With me, because you choose it, because it's what you for its own sake. She looked at him for a moment, the cup warm in her hands, the October mountains behind him going their gold, the northeast corner of Iron Bell's east parcel under their feet. Calloway, she said. I fixed your chimney. I corrected your barn plan. I got 14 cattle out of a burning building. I went to Elias Drum and the county office, and I built a case from the ground up, and I stood up in a room of 43 people and said it out loud. I have been choosing this since the morning I found the post position problem. She paused. You're asking me very late. I know I'm asking late, he said. I'm asking now. Yes, she said. That's the answer. That has always been the answer. You just weren't asking the right question before. He reached across and covered her hand with his warm, certain, the hand of a man who had repaired 1,000 things and knew the difference between holding something and gripping it. She turned her palm up under his, and that was the whole of it, and it was exactly the right size. The south fence section, she said, near the creek. The tension's been going odd since the frost started. I checked it at 5, he said. And sound. Good, they stood at the northeast corner with their coffee, and the morning around them, and the land running in every direction in that enormous, unasked-for way that Wyoming land ran, and she put her free hand beneath her coat without thinking about it, because it was simply true. The same way all the true things about Iron Bell Ranch were simply true, not because they'd been planned for, but because they'd been built toward. One corrected problem at a time, until the structure was holding exactly the load it had been designed to hold. She finished her coffee. He took the empty cup. They walked back toward the house together through the October morning, the frost giving slightly under their boots, the mountains holding their light, Iron Bell Ranch around them doing what it did, holding its ground, bearing its load exactly as built. The gate latch caught on the first try. She'd planed it in May and it had been right ever since. Small things, consequential, the thumb of what a life was when you added it correctly.